The metallic tang of blood was thick in the air as Dr. Mark Ellison stepped into the containment bay. The overhead lights cast a cold, sterile glow on the reinforced steel floors, reflecting off pools of dark crimson that trailed from the loading dock to the center of the room. His gut tightened. Something big had bled a lot. His boots made a dull, splashing sound as he approached the motionless form on the floor. The Graalvek was the largest predator on the planet Y-47. If you combined an earth grizzly with a prehistoric saber-toothed cat and gave it the intelligence of a pack-hunting carnivore, you still wouldn't quite capture what made this thing terrifying. It was 3 meters long from snout to tail, its massive limbs rippling with muscle beneath its thick, obsidian black fur. Razor-sharp retractable claws, each as long as a combat knife, were still half extended. Its powerful jaw, lined with serrated teeth, was slack with exhaustion. And it was dying. The deep, jagged bite wound on its right flank was swollen and dark, the tissue around it beginning to fester. Blood still seeped from the fresh claw marks raked across its shoulder, exposing raw muscle beneath. Mark had seen enough animal wounds in his career to recognize an attack from its own kind. But what struck him more than anything else was the fact that it was here at all. A Graalvek wouldn't just let itself be captured, let alone brought into a human facility. Someone had found it, subdued it, and hauled it onto his clinic floor. That alone was an impossible feat. Behind him, Dr. Vinzel stood stiffly, arms crossed over his narrow chest. The alien veterinarian's smooth violet skin was almost luminescent under the lights, his elongated head tilted slightly in what Mark had come to recognize as disapproval. "I will not treat it," Vinzel stated. Mark glanced at him, exasperated. "Excuse me." Vinzel's black, pupil-less eyes didn't waver. "You do not understand what you are dealing with." Mark turned back to the Graalvek. It let out a ragged, shuddering breath, its massive chest barely rising. It wasn't going to last much longer. "I understand that if we don't help it now, it's going to die." Vinzel exhaled slowly. "That is the natural order." Mark clenched his jaw. "Are you serious? You're the colony's designated alien vet. You're just going to let it bleed out." Vinzel's nostrils flared in irritation. The Graalvek is the apex predator of Y-47. It does not accept assistance. It does not tolerate weakness. If it is wounded, it either recovers or it perishes. That is the way of its kind. Mark knelt beside the beast, carefully scanning its wounds, and if it was just out there in the wild, sure, that might be the case. But someone brought it here. Someone wanted it treated. Vinzel remained silent. Mark wasn't sure if it was out of disapproval or because he secretly agreed. Either way, he didn't care. He moved in closer. The Graalvek's eyes flickered open a pair of dark, bottomless pools, clouded with exhaustion but still aware. Mark swallowed. Even near death, this thing radiated raw power. A deep, rumbling growl vibrated through its throat, but it didn't have the strength to lift its head. Its nostrils flared, taking in his scent. Vinzel took a cautious step back. "You are making a mistake." Mark ignored him. He reached for his med kit. The bite wound was the biggest problem. It was already showing signs of infection. If it spread, the Graalvek wouldn't last another day. His gloved hands hovered over the wound, hesitant. The beast's deep breathing was slow, labored. He took a calming breath and murmured, "Easy there, big guy." Another low rumble. Its claws flexed against the floor, but it didn't strike. "Good," Mark said quietly. "Just hold still, buddy." He grabbed a syringe and prepared a local anesthetic. The Graalvek's thick hide was going to make this tricky, but he had one shot to do this right. Vinzel clicked his tongue disapprovingly. "If it rips your arm off, I will not intervene." Mark rolled his eyes. "Noted." The needle slid in, and the Graalvek flinched, a sharp, warning growl rattling its chest. Mark stayed completely still. The beast's nostrils flared again. Its muscles tensed, claws scraping against the floor. Then slowly it relaxed. Mark let out a quiet breath and finished injecting the anesthetic. That was the moment he knew. This thing understood what he was doing. It knew he was helping. He worked quickly, draining the infected tissue first. The moment the scalpel made the incision, a putrid stench filled the air, thick, blackened pus spilling from the wound. The Grauwek let out a guttural snarl, its entire body going rigid, but it didn't attack. Mark worked fast. He cleaned the wound, cutting away dead tissue, applying antiseptic strong enough to kill anything still festering inside. He stitched it as fast as his hands would allow, his mind racing, adrenaline pumping. The Grauwek's massive form trembled beneath his hands, its deep, ragged breathing hot against the air. Vinzel watched in silence, his usual arrogance replaced with something dangerously close to unease. Finally, the worst of the wound was closed. Mark leaned back on his heels, exhaling. Sweat dripped down his brow. His hands were shaking. The Grauwek's eyes opened again, locking onto his. The weight of its gaze was heavy. A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, the beast let out a deep, exhausted sigh, and its massive head rested against the floor. Vinzel finally spoke. This should not have been possible. Mark wiped the blood from his gloves. Guess today's full of surprises. Vinzel's voice was flat. You have done something unnatural. Mark shook his head. I did my job. Vinzel narrowed his eyes. No, you treated the untreatable. Mark glanced down at the Grauwek, its breathing slow but steady. The fight hadn't left it, but the blind rage, the primal survival instinct it had softened. This wasn't just an apex predator anymore. It was something more. And for the first time in history, a human had earned its trust. The dim glow of the clinic's emergency lighting cast long shadows over the reinforced containment bay. The sterile hum of the ventilators was the only sound besides the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the Grauwek lying in the center of the room. Mark wiped the sweat from his brow, his body still tense despite having spent hours treating the beast. It had survived the initial procedure, but that didn't mean it was out of danger. Dr. Vinzel stood a few feet away, his arms still folded, his elongated violet face unreadable. Mark had learned over the past few months that Vinzel rarely showed emotion in a way humans could easily recognize, but there was something in the way his three nostrils flared that suggested unease. It should not have allowed you to do that, Vinzel stated. Mark exhaled slowly, stretching out his stiff back. Yeah, well, it did. Vinzel's black eyes studied the creature on the floor. And yet you are still alive. You are not missing limbs. You are not torn apart. This is not logical. Mark gave a dry chuckle. I'm going to take that as a compliment. Vinzel did not react. Mark turned back to the Grauwek. The beast had shifted slightly in its sleep, its massive body still heaving from the effort of simply staying alive. He could see where the bite wound had swollen, where the stitches were holding but barely. The claw marks across its shoulder were still raw, and without proper immune treatment, the infection could still come back. That was the biggest issue. Human medicine wasn't designed for something this big. Tell me you have something that can help with infection, Mark said without looking at Vinzel. Vinzel hesitated, then finally spoke. There is a treatment. It has not been tested on Grauwek physiology, but Mark turned to him, brows raised. Defined, not tested. Vinzel's nostrils flared again. It has only been used on mid-tier predators of Y-47. None have exhibited negative reactions, but the Grauwek is different. Mark gestured to the beast. It's also dying. We don't have the luxury of being careful. Vinzel sighed, then moved toward his locked cabinet. The biometric scanner flashed green, and the compartment slid open to reveal a collection of iridescent green vials. He selected one and held it up between two fingers. This will force its immune system into overdrive. If its body accepts it, the infection will be neutralized within hours. If it does not. Mark frowned. What happens? Vinzel met his gaze. Its immune system may attack itself. Mark rubbed the back of his neck, eyes flicking to the beast. It was a gamble, but it was already losing the fight. He didn't have a better option. Give me the dosage, Mark said. Vinzel handed over the vial. I assume you will administer it yourself. Mark gave him a look. Considering you were ready to let it die an hour ago? Yeah. Vinzel didn't argue. Mark prepped the syringe, filling it with the glowing green liquid. It looked otherworldly, almost radioactive under the artificial light. He crouched beside the beast, placing a careful hand on its thick fur. The warmth radiating from its body was unnatural. The fever was worsening. He positioned the syringe at a spot near the bite wound and whispered, "I hope you're as tough as they say." The needle slid in. The Grauwek tensed immediately. Its claws flexed, scraping against the floor. Its breathing hitched, a deep, guttural growl vibrating through its chest. Mark stayed completely still. Vinzel took a slow step back. This may have been unwise. Mark ignored him, watching the Grauwek's reaction closely. Its muscles spasmed once, then twice, before its body suddenly went limp. Mark's stomach twisted. That's not normal, right? Vinzel's eyes widened. I do not know. Mark pressed his fingers against the beast's thick neck, searching for a pulse. It was rapid. Too rapid. Then, out of nowhere, the Grauwek's eyes snapped open. Mark barely had time to react before the massive creature let out a roar, not a growl, not a warning, but a full-bodied, earth-shaking bellow. The reinforced walls shook from the force of it. Mark scrambled backward as the Grauwek's muscles seized violently. Its body convulsed, claws raking against the steel floor, as if fighting an invisible enemy. Vinzel was already against the far wall, fingers hovering near the emergency containment controls. If it goes into a frenzy, we will have to. No, Mark's voice was sharp. He wasn't letting them put it down. The beast twitched again, its back arching. Its jaws clenched, saliva dripping onto the floor. It was overheating, its body pushing itself to the absolute limit. And then just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The Grauwek slumped forward, its chest rising and falling in deep, steady breaths. Mark didn't move for a solid minute. Vinzel spoke first. The immune stimulant worked. Mark let out a slow, shaky breath. Yeah, no kidding. He crawled forward carefully, keeping an eye on the Grauwek's face. The beast's pupils were still dilated, but its expression was different. The raw tension in its body had faded, replaced by something else. It looked at him. Really looked at him. Not with mindless aggression, not with the glazed-over stare of an animal in pain, but with recognition. Mark's chest tightened. "You're okay, big guy." The Grauwek huffed, nostrils flaring. It was exhausted, but it was alive. Vinzel, still clearly shaken, crossed his arms. This does not change what it is. When it recovers fully, it will revert to its nature. Mark scratched the back of his head. Maybe, maybe not. Vinzel gave him a long, unreadable look. You think you have changed something. Mark glanced at the Grauwek again. It was still watching him, still choosing not to strike. He gave a small shrug. I guess we'll find out. For now, the beast was stable. The infection was no longer spreading. Its body was exhausted from the immune response, but if it survived the night, it would have a real chance at recovery. Mark sat back against the wall, finally letting himself relax. The worst was over. Or at least that's what he thought. Mark didn't sleep that night. He stayed in the clinic, sitting on a stool near the containment bay, watching over the Grauwek as it lay in an exhausted heap. Its breathing had steadied, and the fever was beginning to break, but it was still weak. The immune stimulant had worked maybe too well, but at least now, the infection was no longer winning. Across the room, Dr. Vinzel stood silently, observing the scene with his usual mix of skepticism and detachment. His thin fingers twitched occasionally, his black eyes locked onto the Grauwek's unmoving form. I still do not understand why it let you do this, Vinzel finally said. His voice was quieter than usual, more subdued. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Maybe it realized it didn't have a choice. Vinzel shook his head. No, apex predators do not surrender, not even in the face of death. Mark exhaled, rubbing his tired eyes. Then maybe we don't know as much about them as we thought. The Grauwek shifted slightly, its ears flicking at the sound of their voices. Mark tensed, watching for any signs of aggression, but the beast only let out a low, tired huff before settling again. That wasn't normal behavior. If everything Vinzel had said about the species was true, then by now it should have been fighting to escape. Instead, it was still here, still watching him. Mark stood and stretched. His muscles were sore from staying in one position for too long. He walked to the supply cabinet, grabbing a fresh bandage kit. The Grauwek's wounds needed to be checked again, whether it liked it or not. He approached cautiously, though at this point, he had a feeling that if the beast had wanted to kill him, it would have already done so. The Grauwek's dark eyes followed his movements, unblinking. Mark knelt beside it. "You awake, big guy?" The beast didn't respond, but it also didn't growl. That was progress. Slowly, Mark reached toward the stitched-up bite wound. The swelling had gone down, and there were no new signs of infection. That was the best news he'd had all night. The claw marks on its shoulder were healing too, though they still looked nasty. He carefully peeled back part of the bandage, checking for any signs of tearing. The Grauwek tensed. Mark froze. The beast let out a deep, slow exhale. Mark waited, his pulse quickening, but the Grauwek didn't snap or growl. Instead, its head lowered slightly, muscles relaxing. Mark blinked. "Did you just let me do that?" Vinzel straightened from his position across the room. "Impossible." Mark pressed the fresh bandage against the wound and gently secured it in place. The Grauwek huffed, clearly annoyed, but it let him do it. Mark sat back, staring at the beast. "I don't get it," he muttered. Vinzel took a cautious step forward. "Neither do I." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The clinic was quiet except for the soft hum of the air filters and the occasional flickering of the overhead lights. Then, finally, Vinzel exhaled sharply. "This is unprecedented." Mark ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, no kidding." Vinzel hesitated. "You think it has accepted you?" Mark didn't know how to answer that. It wasn't like he'd tamed the thing. The Grauwek wasn't some domesticated animal, and it sure as hell wasn't his friend. But it had allowed him to treat it again when it could have easily torn him apart. That meant something. Mark sighed. "I think it knows I'm not trying to hurt it." Vinzel's expression was unreadable. If that is true, then it changes everything we thought we knew. Mark sat down on the stool again, watching as the Grauwek shifted its weight slightly, making itself more comfortable. He had no idea what the next few days would bring. But one thing was clear: this wasn't just an animal anymore. It was something more. Something no one had ever understood before. And for the first time, a human had earned its trust. Mark had treated thousands of animals in his career, from sedated lions with broken teeth to aggressive wolves nursing bullet wounds. But never in his life had he witnessed a predator react quite like this. The Grauwek had let him tend to its wounds. And now, for the first time since it had been brought in, it wasn't just lying there in exhaustion. It was watching him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine, not out of fear, but out of something else. Recognition. It knew him now. It knew he wasn't a threat. Vinzel remained on the opposite side of the containment bay, his tall frame rigid, his long violet fingers twitching in what Mark had come to recognize as discomfort. "This is not right," Vinzel muttered, more to himself than to Mark. Mark ignored him. He was too focused on the beast in front of him. The Grauwek had started to shift its weight, testing its limbs. It wasn't at full strength yet, but it was recovering faster than expected. Vinzel's voice grew sharper. "It should not be acting like this. The moment it has regained its strength, it should." Mark turned to him. "Should what?" Vinzel hesitated. "Try to kill you." Mark glanced back at the Grauwek. It wasn't trying to kill him. It wasn't even growling. It was tired, but it was calm. That broke every rule Vinzel believed in. Mark exhaled and leaned back against the counter. Maybe it knows I helped. Vinzel scoffed. Predators do not recognize kindness. Maybe they do, Mark countered. Maybe they just don't get the chance to. Vinzel didn't respond. For hours, they watched over the Graalvek, making sure its condition continued to improve. The immune stimulant had done its job. The swelling around the bite wound had receded significantly, and the infection was completely gone. The claw marks had already begun to scab over. The beast's breathing was steady. By the next morning, the Graalvek was able to stand. Mark watched as it slowly rose to its full height, muscles rippling beneath its thick coat of fur. Vinzel tensed immediately. His fingers hovered over the emergency containment controls, ready to activate the reinforced restraints if the creature made a move. Mark didn't reach for any controls. He waited. The Graalvek lifted its massive head and stared directly at him. The moment stretched on. The beast was fully capable of attacking now. It could kill him in seconds if it wanted to. But it didn't. Instead, the Graalvek exhaled a slow, deep breath the kind Mark had seen large predators make when they were acknowledging something without hostility. Mark took a careful step forward. Vinzel hissed in warning, but Mark ignored him. The Graalvek didn't move. It simply watched. Then, Mark did something insane. He reached out. Slowly, carefully, he extended his hand toward the Graalvek's massive shoulder. Vinzel made a sound like he was about to faint. Mark, do not. Mark's fingers brushed against thick fur. The Graalvek let him. No growl, no twitch. Just acceptance. Vinzel was completely silent. Mark stepped back, letting the moment settle. Then, after a long pause, he walked toward the containment bay's main exit and pressed the release button. The reinforced doors hissed open. The outside world waited beyond. For the first time, the Graalvek looked uncertain. It turned its head slightly, its dark eyes flicking between Mark and the open doorway. Mark didn't push it. He simply gestured. Go on, big guy. The Graalvek hesitated a moment longer. Then, in one powerful stride, it stepped forward. Mark watched as the massive creature moved through the doorway, its heavy footfalls echoing through the loading bay. For a brief moment, it paused at the threshold. Then, with one final glance over its shoulder, it disappeared into the trees. Silence filled the clinic. Vinzel exhaled sharply, as if he had been holding his breath the entire time. You are either a genius or an absolute fool. Mark smirked. Maybe both. Vinzel shook his head in disbelief. This is going to change everything. Mark knew it would. Because today, the untouchable had been touched. The apex predator had been healed. And trust had been earned.